My name is Dolores, and I'm 58 years old. He humiliated me in front of everyone after 20 years of loyalty. He called me too old, too slow, too irrelevant. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just looked him in the eye and walked away. Because deep down, I already knew how I'd make him regret it, not with anger, but with intelligence. And years later, when he shook my hand and said thank you, he never realized he was thanking the woman who owned everything he lost. For the last 20 years, I've worked harder than anyone at a small manufacturing company called Hartwell Industries. I believed loyalty mattered. I believed that if you gave people your best, they'd see your worth. But loyalty doesn't mean much to those who confuse kindness for weakness. I learned that the hard way, the day my boss, Brian, decided to make an example out of me. I still remember walking into that building for the first time 2 decades ago. Back then, I was a secretary. Young, hopeful, and maybe a little too eager to please. Hartwell was a modest operation then, run by Mr. Hartwell himself, a gentleman who treated everyone like family. He'd say, "A company's not built by money, Dolores, it's built by people." Those words guided me through every promotion, every late night, every challenge. I started from the bottom, answering phones and making coffee, but I studied the books, learned logistics, and took every chance to prove myself. Over time, I became head of operations, managing the very systems that once overwhelmed me. When Mr. Hartwell retired and sold the company to Brian, I wanted to believe things would stay the same. Brian was younger, confident, and full of what he called new energy. At first, I admired that maybe the company needed someone modern. But over time, that confidence turned into something else. He was charming when it suited him, but behind that polished smile was a man who enjoyed control. I could feel it. In the way he dismissed ideas that weren't his, or how he called me old school whenever I suggested something grounded in experience. Still, I worked hard. I modernized the tracking systems, restructured the production schedules, and cut costs without cutting jobs. I did everything to keep Hartwell Industries alive during our worst financial years. When the market crashed and everyone panicked, I was the one who stayed up till midnight, figuring out how to deliver shipments and meet payroll. I thought that counted for something. I thought loyalty and results still meant something. Then came that Friday morning. It was supposed to be a simple staff meeting, weekly updates, nothing special. I walked into the conference room with my notes in hand, like always. But the air felt different that day. Brian was already standing at the front, his face red and tight, his jaw set like he was preparing for a performance. Around 50 employees filled the room, whispering among themselves. I took my seat, not realizing that my 20 years of service were about to end before everyone's eyes. Brian started talking about a shipment delay that had caused a major client to threaten cancellation. My heart dropped. I'd checked that order myself. The issue wasn't mine. It was a vendor error, one I'd already reported and fixed. But Brian wasn't interested in facts. He was looking for a scapegoat. He turned to me suddenly, his voice sharp. "Dolores, would you like to explain why your department can't manage a basic delivery?" The room went silent. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My throat tightened, but I stood up calmly and said, "It wasn't our department's mistake, Brian. The vendor." He cut me off, slamming his palm on the table. "Stop making excuses. This is exactly the problem. You can't keep up anymore. You're outdated. We need leadership that knows how to run a 21st century business." Laughter rippled through, a few of the younger staff. I could feel the heat rise to my face. "That's not fair," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "You know how much I've done for this company." "Enough," he barked. "You're finished here, Dolores. Pack up your things, effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. He turned to the others and added, "Let this be a lesson. We're moving forward, not backward." Then, he motioned to security, as if I were some kind of criminal. I looked around the room, faces I'd mentored, people I'd guided, trained, defended. Not one of them met my eyes. Some stared at their notes, others looked away. My heart broke in a way I didn't think possible. I gathered my papers, my coffee mug, and that little plant I'd kept by my desk for 15 years. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the box. As the security guard followed me out, I heard Brian's voice behind me, light and mocking. "Take care, Dolores. Enjoy retirement." That was the final twist of the knife. Retirement. He wanted to make me feel old, useless, forgotten. But instead, something inside me hardened. The humiliation burned away the sadness until all that was left was clarity. This wasn't the end of my story, it was the spark that would start something far greater. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face. I set the box on the hood of my car and looked back at the glass building that had defined half my life. My reflection stared back at me older, tired, but not broken. I thought about all those years I'd given, the sacrifices I'd made, the nights I'd worked through tears and fatigue. He wanted to strip me of my dignity in public, but he didn't realize he'd just handed me the one thing I'd been missing, a reason to take back what was mine. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at my shaking hands. The humiliation kept replaying in my head, every word, every snicker from the staff, every sneer from Brian's face. But underneath that pain, another thought grew louder, stronger, impossible to ignore. He fired me in front of everyone, but I would make him answer for it. Not by shouting, not by sinking to his level, but by using what I knew best. The very system he thought I couldn't handle. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the parking lot emptied, I finally turned the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I whispered to myself, barely audible but steady. "You'll regret this, Brian. I promise you will." That night, I didn't sleep. My mind raced through every file, every contract, every weakness in that company that I knew by heart. I wasn't sure what I'd do yet, but I knew one thing for certain: Brian Hartwell had just made the biggest mistake of his career. And as I stared at the ceiling in the dark, an idea began to form, slow, quiet, and unstoppable. Because I already knew exactly how. I'd make him regret every word. That night after Brian fired me, my small kitchen became my war room. I sat there long after midnight, surrounded by old files, dusty folders, and boxes filled with 20 years of paperwork I'd brought home by habit over the years. The dim yellow light flickered against the pile of documents, and I stared at them like puzzle pieces waiting to be rearranged. I replayed every second of that meeting in my head, his smug tone, his cruel smirk, the way everyone looked away. The humiliation still stung, but beneath that burn was something sharper: realization. Brian hadn't fired me because of incompetence. He'd fired me because he needed to hide his own mistakes. I knew that man too well. He always had a secret, always a reason for every public performance. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something had been off for months: late payments to suppliers, strange invoices I was told not to question, decisions made without approval. I had ignored my instincts, thinking I was overreacting. But Brian wasn't just careless. He was crooked. I opened an old storage box filled with printouts I'd kept over the years. Invoices, vendor agreements, budget breakdowns. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but after years in operations, I knew where to start. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the papers. And then I saw them: multiple invoices from companies I didn't recognize, with unverified addresses and inflated costs. One vendor name stood out because it looked familiar. I remembered once calling a number on a similar document, only to find it disconnected. My heart began to race. It didn't take long to piece it together. Brian had been cutting costs by using unapproved vendors, ones that existed only on paper. He was funneling money out of Hartwell Industries to cover his personal debts, maybe even to fund that new sports car and the luxury condo he bragged about. He built his success on the very foundation I had laid and then kicked me aside to keep me quiet. I felt the fury rise in me again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the raw, helpless anger I'd felt that morning. This was controlled, focused, the kind of emotion that builds into strategy. I was done crying. Now, I was calculating. I pulled out a notebook and began jotting down what I knew every weakness in the company's system, every irregularity in the books. 20 years of experience had given me knowledge that no outsider could buy. I knew the company's financial veins like the back of my hand. If Brian had left even one crack exposed, I would find it. By dawn, my kitchen table looked like the aftermath of a storm, papers everywhere. Coffee cups half empty, my handwriting filling every page. I hadn't slept, but I didn't care. For the first time since that awful meeting, I felt alive. I had purpose again. The next afternoon, I picked up my phone and called Margot, an old friend who had retired from accounting a few years earlier. She'd been my mentor when I first started, sharp as a tack and fiercely loyal. When she answered, I could hear the concern in her voice. "Dolores, sweetheart, are you all right?" I told her everything, the humiliation, the false accusations, and the suspicious invoices. She listened quietly, only interrupting with the occasional gasp. When I finished, there was a long pause before she said, "Dolores, you can't go after him. It'll destroy you. You're angry. And I understand. But revenge, it eats people alive." I sighed. "I don't want revenge, Margot. I want justice. He stole my dignity. He stole from the company. If I don't stop him, he'll ruin what's left of Hartwell's legacy." She stayed silent for a few moments, then said softly, "If you're serious, you'll need to be smart. Very smart. Brian plays dirty, but he's sloppy. If anyone can outthink him, it's you." That night, Margot came over with her old laptop and helped me trace through corporate filings, public records, and vendor lists. It didn't take long to uncover more loans Brian had taken out against the company, property titles linked to shell corporations, and whispers of pending lawsuits. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. Hartwell Industries was crumbling under the weight of Brian's greed. But one name kept appearing: Clara Hartwell, the founder's widow. She still owned a minority share, though Brian had kept her out of decisions for years. I remembered her as kind and graceful, but sharp-minded, even in her 70s. If anyone still cared about the company's soul, it would be her. For days, I debated whether to contact her. What would I say? "Hi, remember me? The woman your new CEO humiliated?" I didn't want to sound bitter or desperate, so I framed it differently. I told myself it wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine and protecting what Mr. Hartwell had built. Finally, I called her office and asked if we could meet for coffee. I said I simply wanted closure, to talk about the company I had devoted half my life to. To my surprise, she agreed without hesitation. The next morning, I met her at a quiet cafe downtown. Clara looked exactly as I remembered, poised, elegant, with that calm authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. When she saw me, her eyes softened. "Dolores, dear, I was so sorry to hear what happened," she said, touching my hand gently. "You were always the backbone of that place." We talked for nearly an hour. I told her I missed the company, that I couldn't understand why Brian had turned it into something unrecognizable. She sighed and confessed that she had been unhappy for a long time. "He's reckless," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "I thought bringing in someone young would modernize the business, but all he's done is strip it, for profit." Her words sent a chill through me. Everything I suspected was true. Clara's frustration mirrored my own, except she still had something I didn't: ownership. As she spoke, I began to form a new idea, a dangerous one. If I could find a way to use Clara's stake and my knowledge of the company, maybe I could take back control. Not through anger or scandal, but through strategy. Quiet, legal, and devastating. Clara noticed my thoughtful silence. "You're thinking something, aren't you?" she asked, narrowing her eyes with a faint smile. I smiled back, but only slightly. Just remembering what Mr. Hartwell used to say, that the right people can rebuild anything if they work together. She chuckled softly. He did always believe in rebuilding. Then her tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Dolores, I'm tired of watching Brian destroy everything my husband worked for. If someone could take Brian down." She leaned forward, lowering her voice, her eyes glinting with a mix of anger and hope. I'd help them do it. And just like that, the plan that had sparked in the dark began to burn with light. After that meeting with Clara, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. If someone could take Brian down, I'd help them do it. They echoed in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. For days, I went about my routines, making coffee, watering the plants, pretending to read, but my mind was already building something larger. I knew that what I was considering wasn't simple. It wasn't emotional impulse anymore. It was strategy. It was purpose dressed in patience. Within a week, Clara and I began meeting regularly. Every Thursday morning, we sat in the same quiet corner of that old cafe near the river, the one that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. We always ordered the same things: she, an Earl Grey tea with honey, me, a black coffee that grew cold while we talked. Our conversations started cautiously, but soon, we stopped pretending we were just reminiscing. Clara was more than ready to admit the truth. Brian was bleeding Hartwell Industries dry. One morning, she leaned forward with that calm, dignified composure of hers and said, "Dolores, he's driving the company into the ground. I've seen the reports. Sales are down, morale is worse, and he's pulling funds from accounts that used to be sacred. It's as if he's determined to destroy what my husband built." I listened quietly, nodding. "He's not destroying it, Clara. He's trying to sell it off piece by piece. But I have a plan. One that could end this and give Hartwell back its soul." Clara's eyes lifted. Curious but cautious. "What kind of plan?" I took a deep breath before I said it. "I want to buy him out. Not openly, not under my name. I want to purchase his shares through a holding company. Anonymously. He'll never know it's me." She blinked, taken aback, the teacup, pausing midair. "Buy him out? Dolores, that's bold. And expensive. Where would you even get the money for something like that?" I hesitated. It wasn't an easy thing to say out loud. After my husband passed, I received his life insurance. I've never touched most of it. I also have my pension, my savings. It's not enough to buy the entire company. But with your shares and a few careful maneuvers, we could control the majority. Clara studied me for a long time, her eyes narrowing in that way people do, when they're weighing not just the numbers, but the person behind them. Then, slowly, she smiled. "You're serious." "As serious as I've ever been," I said. "You gave that company its start, Clara. I helped it grow. And now, we're watching it crumble under a man who doesn't care about anything but his reflection. We can fix that." She looked out the window for a while, the morning sun catching the edge of her silver hair. Then she nodded. "All right, let's do this. But we'll do it quietly." That's how Silverline Holdings was born, a name we came up with together over breakfast the next week. I remember Clara saying, "It sounds clean, professional, and invisible. Exactly what we need." The purpose was simple: to act as a discreet shell company that would purchase controlling interest in Hartwell Industries without linking it to either of us. I called Margot the moment I left that cafe. When she answered, I could hear the skepticism in her voice before I even finished explaining. "Dolores, this isn't revenge anymore. This is business warfare." "I know," I replied. "But it's also justice. You saw the proof. He's stealing from that company and he humiliated me to cover it. I can stop him not by destroying him but by outsmarting him." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Margot finally said, "All right then. Tell me what you need." The three of us, me, Clara, and Margot, became an unlikely trio of strategists. We met in Clara's study, the air thick with the scent of old books and determination. Margot handled the paperwork, Clara used her contacts, and I provided the inside knowledge. We hired a business broker under the pretense of representing an anonymous investor. The broker was a soft-spoken man named Elliot, meticulous and discreet. He didn't ask questions. He just made things happen. Weeks passed in a blur of legal forms, silent calls, and coded emails. Every move had to be calculated. If Brian caught wind of who was behind the purchase, everything would fall apart. I lived in a state of quiet tension, half exhilaration, half terror. But underneath it all was something steady. purpose. I finally felt like I was doing something that mattered again. One afternoon, Margot called with news that made my heart stop. "Dolores," she said, "the broker found something. Brian's been trying to sell off parts of Hartwell to cover his personal debts. He's desperate for liquidity." I froze. "So he's vulnerable?" "Very," Margot replied. "He's in deeper than anyone realizes." That changed everything. For the first time, the idea of owning Hartwell didn't feel impossible. It felt inevitable. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brian had fired me to keep control of his failing empire, and now his desperation was about to hand me the keys. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the house was silent, I would stare at the papers spread across my dining table and wonder if I was crossing some moral line. Was I any better than him, taking something in secret? But then I'd remember the humiliation, the sneer on his face, and the way everyone looked at me like I was disposable. No, this wasn't cruelty. This was restoration. 2 weeks later, Clara invited me over to sign the final documents for Silverline Holdings. She wore her husband's old reading glasses, and her hand trembled slightly as she slid the papers toward me. "Once we do this, there's no going back," she said. I met her gaze and replied, "That's the point." When it was done, we sat back in silence for a long moment, the weight of what we'd done settling over us like a blanket. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming something sacred: pride, integrity, dignity. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror. My reflection stared back at me older, perhaps a little weary, but with a glint in my eye that hadn't been there in years. I whispered softly to myself, "You fired me publicly, but you'll thank me privately." The words felt like a promise carved in glass, sharp and unbreakable. Days passed quietly, everyone filled with anticipation. Then, one gray morning, as I was pouring my coffee, my phone rang. It was Elliot, the broker. His voice was trembling when he spoke. "Dolores, he's selling," he said. "And he doesn't even know it's to you." My hand froze mid-air, the cup hovering just above the saucer. I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from something deeper: victory, patience rewarded. The silent alliance had done its work. And now, the game was about to begin. The morning after Elliot's call, I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where this entire plan had been born in sleepless fury, and felt the faintest tremor in my hands. Brian was selling. The man who had stood before an entire company and declared that I was obsolete was about to hand me his empire, and he didn't even know it. It wasn't just justice anymore. It was irony in its purest form. But I couldn't let emotion cloud precision. This had to be flawless, invisible, and controlled. Revenge, when done properly, doesn't roar. It whispers. I called Elliot that afternoon and told him to proceed, but to keep everything as quiet as possible. "No traces," I said. "No names that can circle back to me or Clara. We stay shadows." He assured me he understood. The offer would go through 3 layers of companies, all registered under Silverline Holdings but routed through separate management firms. On paper, it would look like a simple corporate buyout, nothing unusual, nothing personal. It was the kind of complexity that protected powerful people. And now, for the first time in my life, it was protecting me. While the paperwork moved through legal channels, I waited. Waiting had never been one of my virtues, but in this game, patience was power. Brian, meanwhile, grew restless. From what I heard through quiet contacts still inside Hartwell, he had been trying for months to sell off smaller divisions to pay off his personal debts. He'd been living far beyond his means: expensive cars, luxury trips, parties that drained company resources. When Elliot's offer arrived, disguised as a generous investment from an industrial growth firm, Brian didn't think twice. He was desperate for cash and too arrogant to look deeper. I imagined the smirk on his face as he signed those preliminary documents, thinking he'd outsmarted another investor. If only he knew. I almost pitied him, almost. 2 weeks later, Elliot called again. "It's done," he said simply. My heart stopped. He accepted the offer? Completely. The transfer will be finalized next week. You'll have controlling interest once the funds clear. I hung up the phone and sat in silence. After everything, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the bitterness, it was happening. Not with shouting or vengeance, but with signatures and silence. I thought of how Brian had fired me in front of everyone, making me feel small and powerless. Now, I was buying the very stage he'd used to humiliate me. Clara and I met in a private office on the top floor of a downtown building to finalize the transfer. The air smelled faintly of leather and old carpet, and the only sounds were the soft clicks of pens and the turning of papers. Clara wore a proud expression that reminded me of how I used to feel in my early days at Hartwell, steady, confident, capable. When we both signed the final page, I felt something shift deep inside me. It wasn't just triumph, it was release, the kind that comes when justice finally catches up to arrogance. "It's yours now," Clara said softly, sliding the documents toward me. "No," I replied, smiling faintly. "It's ours." For a moment, we just sat there, letting the gravity of it sink in. I wasn't sure what emotion filled me more: satisfaction, disbelief, or poetic irony. Maybe it was all three, tangled together. But I didn't reveal myself yet. That would have been too easy. Instead, I told Elliot to keep Brian in place for now. Let him believe he was still running things. Let him keep walking those halls, thinking he was the king of a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. I wanted him to feel safe, unchallenged, right up until the moment he realized the truth. Within weeks of the acquisition, Brian began receiving new memos from what he thought was corporate headquarters. They were clear, concise, and direct performance adjustments, budget reviews, restructuring suggestions. What he didn't know was that I wrote every single word. Elliot sent them under Silverline's official letterhead, and each time Brian received one, he complained bitterly to the staff about corporate meddlers who don't know what they're doing. The irony made me smile. He followed those directives anyway, of course. He was too frightened of losing what he believed was his position to argue too loudly. Slowly, quietly, I began undoing his worst decisions. I re-established vendor relationships he'd severed, corrected financial policies he'd twisted, and put trusted employees back into key positions. All of it was done behind the scenes, through instructions that he followed without question. It was as if I were guiding the company's heartbeat again, restoring it one careful pulse at a time. Every time a report came in showing improvement, I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. The numbers were rising, the debts shrinking, the staff morale climbing. The company was healing, and it was all under the leadership of a man who didn't even realize he was being led. I thought about how poetic it was. He had called me outdated, claimed I couldn't keep up with modern business. Yet here I was, managing everything more efficiently than he ever could, using his arrogance as the very tool of his undoing. But as the weeks went on, I began to feel a strange kind of empathy for him. Not forgiveness that was too generous, but understanding. Brian's pride had destroyed him long before I ever decided to act. He wasn't a villain in his own mind. He was just a man too blinded by ego to see the damage he caused. Still, I couldn't deny the satisfaction in knowing he was dancing to my tune without ever realizing it. One evening, as I sat at my desk going through documents, I drafted a memo that made my hand tremble with something close to joy. It was brief and formal, nothing extraordinary at first glance, just a directive for strategic restructuring and updated leadership reports. But at the bottom, for the first time, I signed it personally, from the desk of your new majority partner. When I leaned back and read those words, my chest filled with a quiet triumph I can't fully describe. I imagined the look on his face when he saw that memo, his confusion, his disbelief. I didn't need to see it in person. The image in my mind was enough. I sealed the envelope and sent it off through Elliot, confident that by the next morning, it would be sitting on Brian's desk. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The storm that had raged in me since that humiliating day was finally settling into calm. I wasn't angry anymore, I was in control. I had taken back what was mine, not through chaos, but through quiet, deliberate power. But peace, I learned, is never permanent. Because the next morning, just as the sun broke over the horizon, my phone rang again. It was Elliot, his voice almost shaking with amusement. "Dolores," he said, "you might want to hear this." Brian just stormed into the office, shouting at everyone. He's waving that memo around, demanding to know who his new partner is. I smiled, staring out my window at the light spilling across the street. He had no idea whose signature was on those papers in his hand. And that was exactly how I wanted it. The morning Brian demanded the meeting, I already knew it was coming. It had been 3 weeks since he'd received that memo, and the rumor of a new majority partner had spread like wildfire through Hartwell Industries. Employees whispered about it in corridors, and Brian's temper had grown worse by the day. He'd thrown reports across his office, yelled at assistants, and demanded answers no one could give him. And then, finally, he sent a terse message through Elliot's office. "I want a meeting with the new partner. Now." I told Elliot to set it up, but on my terms. "Make it formal," I said. Same boardroom, the big one. I didn't have to explain which one. It was the same boardroom where Brian had fired me in front of everyone. The same long mahogany table where I had stood trembling, trying to defend myself, while he smirked and stripped me of my dignity. If this was going to end, it would end there, not with shouting or revenge, but with quiet, undeniable truth. The day of the meeting arrived gray and cool, with clouds pressing low against the windows. I wore a dark navy suit, the same shade I used to wear when I led quarterly briefings years ago. My hair was pinned neatly, my face calm. Inside, though, my heart beat like a slow drum, not out of fear, but anticipation. There's a strange calm that comes when justice is finally within reach. Elliot arranged everything. The meeting was set for 10 in the morning. Brian would walk into the boardroom, expecting to face an investor or some faceless executive. Instead, he would face me. I arrived early and waited in the adjoining room, hidden behind the door that led into the boardroom. Through the thin glass, I could hear the muffled sound of chairs being adjusted and papers being shuffled. Then, the heavy door creaked open, and Brian's voice filled the air, the same arrogant tone I remembered all too well. "So," he said, "who owns me now? Let's not waste time." His footsteps echoed as he paced the room. I imagined him standing where I once stood, his impatience crackling through every movement. "Come on," he snapped. "Let's meet this big investor. I'd like to know who thinks they can run my company." That was my cue. Inside. For a split second, the room went utterly still. Brian turned, expecting someone powerful, someone foreign, not me. His face drained of color so quickly it was almost comical. His jaw tightened, his eyes widened, and for once, words seemed to fail him. "Hello, Brian," I said softly, my voice steady. "It's been a while." He blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. "You?" he stammered, a dry laugh escaping his lips. "This is a joke. Please tell me this is some kind of twisted prank." I walked slowly to the table, my heels quiet on the polished floor. "Not a joke," I said. "A buyout." He shook his head, forcing a smirk. "No, you couldn't possibly. You don't have the resources, Dolores. You were fired. You're obsolete?" I finished for him. "Yes, I remember that word." I opened my briefcase and took out the signed documents, sliding them across the table toward him. "Go ahead, read it. Every page is legal and binding. Hartwell Industries is now owned by Silver Line Holdings, and I paused just long enough to meet his eyes. Am the majority shareholder." His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents. The silence in that room was almost sacred, the same silence that had once suffocated me when I stood there, humiliated. Now it was his turn to sit in it. He tried to laugh again, but it came out weak, brittle. "You really think this means you've won?" "This isn't about winning," I said evenly. "It's about restoring what you destroyed. You treated this company like your playground. You stole from its heart and blamed everyone else for your mistakes, including me. Brian leaned back in his chair, his arrogance faltering but not gone. You can't just walk in here and take over. I've been running this place for years. Yes, I said. Into the ground. He glared at me, his pride struggling to find footing. Fine, he said finally. Then maybe we can work something out. You've made your point, Dolores. Let's manage this together. You can be the face. I'll handle operations. I almost laughed at the irony. The same operations you mishandled for years? No, Brian. I think we're done pretending. You've had your turn. It's time for leadership that knows how to rebuild. I stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the city skyline. When you fired me, you said I was finished, too old, too outdated. But what you didn't realize is that experience doesn't expire, it evolves, and it remembers. He didn't respond. I could feel his anger boiling behind me, but he didn't dare explode. He knew I had the upper hand now. Finally, I turned back to face him. Your services, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, are no longer required. I'll have legal draft your severance package by end of week. For a moment, I thought he might say something cutting, something cruel, to reclaim a bit of power, but all he could do was stare. The realization that he'd lost everything was dawning in his eyes like a slow sunrise. As he stood to leave, his chair scraping against the floor, I added quietly, "Don't worry, Brian. You'll thank me someday." He paused at the door, his hand gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles whitened. Then, without a word, he walked out. When the door shut behind him, the silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't heavy or humiliating. It was peaceful, victorious, complete. I sat back down in the chair at the head of the table, my chair now, and let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the space where he'd stood. The memory of my own firing flickered in my mind, but instead of pain, I felt something else release. I had taken back everything he'd tried to strip from me, my dignity, my purpose, my pride. When I left the boardroom, I walked past the same employees who had once looked away in silence. This time, they met my eyes. Some even smiled. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration of the company, of my self-respect, of balance. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and watched the sunset from my balcony. The sky burned with orange and gold, and for the first time in years, I felt content. It was over. I had faced him. And I had won not through cruelty, but through grace. Or at least, I thought it was over. Because 2 days later, my phone rang. Elliot's voice was uneasy, his tone clipped. "Dolores?" he said. "We have a problem. Brian's not letting this go. He's planning something that could hurt you." I set my glass down slowly, feeling the calm around me shift. I thought that was the end of it, but Brian had one last move I didn't see coming. It had been only a few peaceful days since Brian stormed out of that boardroom when the quiet began to crack. At first it was small things, a strange email from a supplier asking if the rumors were true, a missed call from an investor who suddenly wanted to review our financials. Then came the whispers. Someone was spreading stories that I had embezzled company funds, that the buyout was fraudulent, that I had stolen Hartwell Industries from under Brian's nose. I tried to ignore it, assuming it would pass, but the messages kept coming. By the end of the week, there were anonymous calls at all hours, accusing emails filled with venom, and even a few letters slipped under my office door. Margot was the first to say what we were all thinking. "It's him," she said flatly, scrolling through the email headers. The language, the phrasing, this has Brian's ego written all over it. She turned the screen toward me, showing me one of the fake posts circulating online. It accused me of manipulating shareholders and using shady financial tricks to steal control of the company. "He's trying to scare you," she added, "to make you look like the villain." I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. For a moment, anger flickered through me, but it didn't last. Instead, I felt something colder, a steady, calculating resolve. "Then we'll show him what the truth looks like," I said. Rather than react publicly, I decided to collect everything quietly. Every message, every email, every rumor that could be traced back to him, I documented it all. I had learned a long time ago that power wasn't in shouting the loudest. It was in knowing when to stay silent until the right moment. Margot helped me track digital footprints through her old accounting contacts. And sure enough, the trails led back to one source: an unregistered server address connected to Brian's personal devices. He wasn't just bitter, he was desperate. He'd lost his position, his income, and his reputation. And now he was clawing at whatever scraps of power he could find. But the one thing Brian had never understood about me was that I didn't break under pressure. I planned under it. Clara called me one afternoon after hearing the latest rumor through one of her old business friends. Her voice was calm, but there was anger simmering underneath. "He's trying to drag you down with him," she said. "You need to put a stop to this before it spreads any further. And I think I know how." Clara didn't hesitate. "Then I'll help you. I still know a few good lawyers who specialize in corporate defamation." By the end of the week, I was sitting in a polished office across from an attorney named Samuel Green Sharp, articulate and visibly thrilled by the challenge. He had read every document I sent, every trace of Brian's digital smear campaign. "This is solid," he said, tapping the folder. "You have proof of malicious intent, defamation, and harassment. We can make an example out of him." I hesitated for a moment. "I don't want revenge," I said carefully. "I just want the truth to stand on its own." Samuel smiled faintly. "Then we'll let the truth do the talking." The lawsuit was filed the following Monday, a formal complaint for defamation and harassment, supported by pages of evidence showing Brian's involvement in the false rumors. I didn't make a public statement. I didn't need to. The mere existence of that document spoke louder than anything I could have said. Brian's response came fast and predictably. He mocked me online, calling the lawsuit a sad attempt at attention and claiming that I was fabricating drama to cover my guilt. He even went so far as to post a short video of himself in his new home office, smirking into the camera, saying, "Some people can't handle losing gracefully." For a while, people commented, speculated, argued. But then, a week later, the summons was delivered to his doorstep and all the arrogance drained from his face. I know this because one of his former assistants, who had always admired me, described the moment in vivid detail: how Brian turned pale as he opened the envelope, how he stood frozen for nearly a minute before slamming the door shut. The tide began to turn. Slowly, people started coming forward, employees who had worked under Brian, suppliers who had been bullied by him, even junior managers who'd been silenced during his reckless decisions. They wrote letters and affidavits, describing years of mistreatment, manipulation, and deceit. It was as if the whole company had been waiting for someone to stand up first, and now that I had, they followed. Clara was by my side through it all. She sat in the front row during hearings, dignified and unshakable, while Margot handled the financial reports that exposed just how deep Brian's mismanagement went. Every number, every transaction, painted a picture of arrogance and greed. The courtroom sessions stretched over weeks, each one peeling away another layer of Brian's facade. He tried to bluff his way through the proceedings, making excuses, blaming others, and even accusing me of setting him up. But the evidence was relentless. The emails, the forged invoices, the digital fingerprints, all of it pointed back to him. I remember the moment he finally cracked on the stand. The lawyer asked him directly, "Mr. Brian Shaw, did you or did you not send these anonymous messages accusing Mrs. Dolores Grant of financial misconduct?" His voice faltered. I don't recall." Samuel leaned forward. "Then perhaps you'll recall this timestamp from your personal email account." The courtroom fell silent as the exhibit appeared on the screen, one of the messages sent directly from Brian's laptop, minutes before he'd denied writing it. I didn't feel triumph in that moment. I felt relief. The truth was enough. I didn't need to see him suffer. I just needed to see him stripped of the lies that had once made him powerful. The final day of the trial came on a quiet Friday afternoon. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped together, while the judge read through her final remarks. Brian looked smaller somehow, the fire gone from his eyes, his shoulders slumped. The judge's tone was firm but not cruel. "Mr. Shaw," she said, "the evidence against you is overwhelming. You've defamed a woman who gave her life to building this company. You tried to destroy her reputation for your own gain." She paused, letting the silence settle. "You owe her restitution for the damages you've caused, and more than that, you owe her something that money cannot buy." Brian looked up, confused. "What's that?" he muttered. The judge met his gaze squarely. "You owe her respect." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt something inside me, loosen a knot I hadn't realized I was still carrying. When I stepped out of the courthouse that day, the sun was shining. Not blinding, not harsh, just warm. Like quiet forgiveness. I hadn't destroyed Brian. Life had done that on its own. All I had done was give the truth a voice. But deep down, I knew something still lingered. Brian wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily. And though justice had been served in that courtroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that his story with me wasn't finished yet. In the weeks that followed the trial, the dust around Hartwell Industries began to settle. The rumors died down, the headlines faded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the company breathed again. I spent long days and even longer nights inside that building, not as the frightened woman escorted out of it months before, but as the one guiding it back to life. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo of the factory machines felt familiar, almost sacred. I knew this place, its rhythm, its people, its heartbeat. It wasn't just a company to me, it was a legacy, and it was time to restore it to what it once was. The first thing I did was call a meeting, not a public performance like Brian's, but an honest conversation. I stood in front of the staff, most of whom had been there the day he fired me. Their faces were cautious at first, uncertain of how to act, but I smiled and told them the truth. "We've all been through something difficult," I began, "but we're still here. Hartwell was built on trust, and it's time we bring that back." There were tears in some eyes, nods in others. I reinstated fair pay, restructured management to promote loyalty over flattery, and reopened opportunities for employees who had been sidelined by Brian's arrogance. Slowly, I saw the light return to the people's faces, the spark of pride that comes when hard work is finally respected. I walked the factory floors daily, greeting workers by name, asking about their families, remembering birthdays. Some of them told me quietly that they'd never thought they'd see the day Hartwell felt like a family again. And in those moments, I knew I had done the right thing. Revenge might have started my journey, but rebuilding had become my redemption. With Clara's help, we reinstated the founder's original ethics charter, a document long buried under corporate jargon. It emphasized craftsmanship, integrity, and community. I had it framed and placed in the lobby so that every person who walked through those doors would remember what Hartwell stood for. Months passed, and the company's numbers began to rise. Investors who once doubted us now praised our recovery. For the first time in years, Hartwell Industries was debt-free, profitable, and stable. The turnaround caught the attention of local business journals, and articles started calling me the woman who brought Hartwell back from the brink. Every time I saw one of those headlines, I thought of Brian, the man who had once tried to erase me, and I wondered where he was now. I didn't have to wonder for long. One quiet afternoon, I was in my office reviewing the quarterly reports when my assistant knocked softly on the door. "Mrs. Grant," she said hesitantly, "there's someone here asking to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." I looked up, half distracted. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "It's Brian Shaw." The pen slipped from my fingers and rolled across the desk. For a moment, I just stared at it. The air in the room suddenly heavier. "Send him in," I said finally. When the door opened, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who walked in wasn't the sharp, confident executive I'd known. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his face pale and drawn. He looked tired, not just physically, but in his soul. His arrogance had been replaced by something unfamiliar in him: humility. He stood there awkwardly, glancing around the office, taking in the framed ethics charter on the wall, the new team photos, the subtle warmth that had replaced his sterile corporate style. "You changed everything," he said quietly. I nodded. I had to. He let out a small, bitter laugh. "I always thought I knew better than everyone. Turns out, I was just digging my own grave." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "I heard about the trial, about what you did. You ran it better than I ever did, Dolores. I ruined it." For a long time, I said nothing. I just watched him, remembering the man who had once humiliated me in front of the entire company, the man who had smiled as I carried my box of belongings past him. Now, he looked nothing like that person. Time had stripped away his pride, leaving something fragile behind. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the window. "You probably think I deserve everything that happened. And maybe I do. I don't think about that anymore," I said softly. "What's done is done." He nodded slowly, then stepped closer to the desk. "I came here because I wanted to say something I should have said a long time ago." He took a deep breath, as if forcing the words out. "Thank you. For saving the business. For fixing what I broke. You could have let it all fall apart just to spite me, but you didn't. You actually cared." His voice wavered slightly, and in that moment, I saw the man behind the ego flawed, human. I stood up, walked around the desk, and met his gaze. "Hartwell was never about one person," I said. "It's bigger than you. Bigger than me. It always was." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "Still, thank you." I shook it, steady and calm, feeling the weight of every unspoken memory between us. My hand didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. There was no anger left, just a strange, peaceful stillness. He didn't know that I was the one who had bought the company, that every decision made under corporate had come from me. He thought I'd merely rebuilt what remained after his fall, and I let him believe that. Because this moment wasn't about proving power, it was about closing a circle that had been open far too long. As he turned to leave, I whispered softly, almost to myself, "You finally thanked me, just like I said you would." He didn't hear it. He didn't need to. When the door shut behind him, I stood there for a long time, staring out the window at the city skyline. The sunset painted everything gold, and for the first time since that humiliating day in the boardroom, I felt free. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't victory. It was closure, the kind that comes when you've faced your past, forgiven it, and moved beyond it. Later that evening, I called Clara and Margot to tell them what had happened. Clara laughed softly. "You see, dear, sometimes revenge doesn't come with fire and fury. Sometimes it comes with peace," Margot added with a chuckle. "And in your case, it came with a handshake." We laughed together, the sound light and unburdened. I realized then that my story wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming respect, proving that dignity could outlast cruelty, and that sometimes the sweetest justice is silent. As I hung up the phone and turned off the lights in my office, I felt a new kind of anticipation stirring inside me. I thought everything had finally ended. But life, it seems, always has one more chapter to write, and as I would soon learn, mine was about to take a turn I never expected. The months that followed Brian's visit were some of the most transformative of my life. For the first time in years, Hartwell Industries wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The company that had once been a battlefield of egos and greed had become a place of hope and innovation. Every corner of that building now held laughter, purpose, and a quiet pride that reminded me of the old days under Mr. Hartwell. But this time, it was different. It was better. Because this time, it was being rebuilt by people who truly cared. Word of our revival spread quickly through the business community. Analysts who had written us off as a failing company began to take notice again. Investors started calling, eager to understand how a once-sinking operation had managed to rise from the ashes in less than 2 years. What they didn't realize was that the secret wasn't in numbers or strategy, it was in people. It was in trust, integrity, and the belief that everyone, no matter their age or title, still had something valuable to give. I made it my mission to rebuild not just the company, but its culture. The first policy I introduced was a hiring initiative for women over 50 experienced professionals who had been quietly cast aside by other companies in favor of fresh faces. I knew their pain too well. I had lived it. And I wanted to create a place where experience wasn't seen as a liability but as an asset. One of the first women we hired was a production manager named Elaine, who had been laid off from her previous job after 25 years of loyal service. The day I handed her the offer letter, she cried. "No one wants people like us anymore," she said through tears. I smiled and told her, "Then we'll build a place that does." Seeing her thrive, leading teams with confidence and wisdom, became one of my proudest moments. Clara stood by my side through every step of the transformation. Though she had retired from most of her public engagements, she found renewed purpose in our mission. Together, we launched the Hartwell Foundation, a mentorship and grant program for midlife professionals looking to restart their careers or businesses. Clara often said, "We can't change the world overnight, but we can light the path for those still walking in the world." Dark. Margot, ever the steady hand, took charge of our financial systems. Her meticulous eye ensured that every transaction was transparent, every account clean. After years of chaos under Brian's leadership, it was a relief to see the numbers line up with honesty again. She ran her department with precision, but also with warmth. "Integrity is the new profit," she liked to say, and it became something of a mantra across the company. Before long, the local media caught wind of our story. "The miraculous turnaround of Hartwell Industries." One headline read. Another called me, "The woman who redefined second chances." Reporters asked how I'd done it, how a 58-year-old woman had resurrected a dying company and made it profitable again. I always gave the same answer. By believing in people the world stopped believing in. None of them knew the full truth, of course. They didn't know the humiliation, the betrayal, or the quiet revenge that had sparked it at all. But I didn't need them to. Some victories don't belong on paper. They live quietly in the hearts of those who earned them. The recognition grew beyond what I ever imagined. I was invited to speak at conferences, to share my story with audiences of business leaders and aspiring entrepreneurs. Standing on those stages, looking out at hundreds of faces, I spoke about resilience, about how failure doesn't define you unless you let it. I told them that wisdom doesn't fade with age, it deepens. Every scar, every setback is proof that you've lived and learned. And as I spoke, I realized something unexpected. My success was no longer about revenge. It wasn't even about proving Brian wrong anymore. It was about redemption for myself, for every woman who had been dismissed, underestimated, or made to feel like her time had passed. I wasn't just rebuilding a company. I was rebuilding belief. Under my leadership, Hartwell became debt-free for the first time in decades. We expanded into sustainable manufacturing, opened 2 new facilities, and earned awards for ethical business practices. Each milestone felt less like a victory for me and more like justice for everyone who had been silenced by arrogance and greed. Sometimes, during interviews, people would bring up Brian's name. They'd ask if I had stayed in touch or what I thought of him now. I always answered honestly but without malice. "Brian taught me how not to lead," I would say. And that was true. He had shown me that leadership built on fear will always crumble, but leadership rooted in respect endures. Occasionally, I'd hear things about him, small updates from people in the industry. He had moved out of state, started a modest consulting firm, and lived quietly. Once, someone told me he spoke well of me now, calling me the one who saved Hartwell. I never reached out to confirm it, but the thought brought me peace. Maybe, in his own way, he had finally learned something too. Years began to pass, and Hartwell Industries transformed from a wounded business into a model of integrity and innovation. Every time I walked through the glass doors and saw the name Hartwell gleaming above, I felt a quiet pride that went beyond profit or recognition. It was proof that even the most broken things can be rebuilt stronger than before. Still, even as everything fell beautifully into place, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was unfinished. There was a whisper in the back of my mind, a quiet tug reminding me that the story wasn't fully closed yet. I had avenged the humiliation, reclaimed my power, and found peace. But there was one final thing left to do. Something that would bring everything full circle, not for vengeance this time, but for closure. I didn't yet know what form it would take, only that it was waiting for me just beyond the horizon of success. In that space where the past and the present meet. I had spent years rebuilding from the ashes, but now, it was time to complete the story that had started with fire and ended in grace. Because even after all I had built, all I had healed, one truth remained. Some endings aren't truly endings at all, they're beginnings disguised as peace. And deep down, I could feel it, the beginning of my final chapter calling to me. Years passed, and life found a new rhythm, quieter, gentler, but full. Hartwell Industries had become everything I dreamed it could be, honest, strong, and human. The foundation Clara and I built continued to grow, mentoring hundreds of midlife professionals who were rediscovering their confidence, their voice, and their worth. I had achieved everything I set out to do, and more. But one thought lingered, tucked away in a quiet corner of my heart, unfinished, patient, waiting. I had spent years rebuilding what Brian tried to destroy. Years proving that experience, integrity, and perseverance could outshine cruelty. Yet, for all the peace I had found, there was a quiet pull I couldn't ignore. I knew it was time for one last step, not for revenge, not for triumph, but for closure. My final move. One cool autumn morning, I found myself driving down a familiar road that led far from the city. The trees along the highway glowed in shades of amber and gold, their leaves drifting lazily in the wind. I wasn't entirely sure what I expected to find, but I followed an instinct deeper than logic, the same instinct that had guided every turn of my story. After nearly 2 hours, I reached a small town, quiet and unassuming, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's names. The streets were lined with modest shops, a bakery, a florist, a barber. And there, on the corner, stood a little hardware store with a faded sign that read Shaw's Supplies. I parked across the street and sat in silence for a long moment, staring through the windshield. The man behind the counter inside looked older, grayer, but unmistakably familiar. Brian. He moved slowly, wiping down shelves, talking to a customer with a polite smile. There was no trace of the arrogance that had once defined him. No flash of superiority or charm, just quiet labor and humility. For a brief moment, I almost turned away. Maybe he had already been punished enough by life. Maybe walking in would only reopen wounds that had already healed. But then I remembered the woman I had been the day he fired me, humiliated, broken, yet defiant. That woman deserved this moment. Not to gloat, not to wound, but to complete the story. I took a deep breath and crossed the street. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered, the familiar scent of wood and oil filling the air. Brian looked up from the counter, ready to greet another customer, and froze when he saw me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he managed a faint smile. "Dolores," he said quietly, his voice carrying both surprise and something else, perhaps. Gratitude. "Well, I'll be damned." "Hello, Brian," I said, keeping my tone calm, even gentle. "It's been a long time." He nodded slowly. "Almost 10 years, I think." He looked around the small store as if embarrassed by its simplicity. "Not quite the boardroom we're used to, huh?" "No," I said, glancing at the shelves. "But it suits you." He laughed softly, and for the first time, it wasn't bitter. "You're not wrong. I used to think success was about control, about power. Turns out it's just about peace of mind." We stood there for a moment, two people shaped by the same storm, now meeting again under calm skies. He gestured toward a small table near the window. "I was just about to make coffee. Care to join me?" I hesitated only a second before nodding. "I'd like that." The coffee was simple, black, and a little too strong, but somehow perfect for the moment. We talked not about the past at first, but about small things, the town, the weather, the changes in the world. His laugh had softened. His eyes, once sharp with pride, now carried something gentler. Finally, after a stretch of silence, he said quietly, "I saw what you did with Hartwell. The news stories, the foundation, everything. You turned it into something good. Better than I ever could." I looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "You sound proud." He smiled sadly. "I am. I ruined that place. I hurt a lot of people. You fixed it, and somehow, you fixed me too. Just by proving it could be done differently." Part of me wanted to tell him everything, how I had bought the company, how I had orchestrated his downfall. But looking at him now, humbled and human, I realized he didn't need to know. The truth would serve no purpose anymore. He had already learned what he was meant to learn. "I forgave you a long time ago, Brian," I said softly. "You don't owe me anything." He lowered his gaze, his hands tightening around the coffee cup. "That's where you're wrong," he said after a moment. "I owe you everything. I never forgave myself for what I did to you, for what I became. You were the heart of that company, and I threw you out like you were nothing. You had every right to destroy me. But instead, you rebuilt something beautiful." I felt my throat tighten, emotion rising unexpectedly. "We all make mistakes," I said gently. "What matters is what we learn from them." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "You always did see things clearer than I did." When I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. He simply smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried more sincerity than any of his grand gestures from the past. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I want you to have this," I said, handing it to him. He frowned, unfolding it carefully. It wasn't long, just one simple line, written in my own handwriting. "What you took from me gave me everything I needed." For a moment, he just stared at it. Then he looked up, his eyes full of understanding. "That's true, isn't it?" "It is," I said, smiling faintly. "Goodbye, Brian." As I stepped out into the cool air, the bell above the door jingled again, soft and final. I walked back to my car and sat there for a while, watching him through the window as he returned to his work, the note resting beside the register. He didn't look defeated anymore, just peaceful. Driving away, I felt no triumph, no regret, just stillness, the kind that comes when every thread of a story has been tied, every shadow given light. Life had given me the last word, not through vengeance or power, but through understanding. As I neared the city, I passed by the Hartwell Industries building. The sign gleamed under the evening sun, proud and unbroken, just like me. I pulled over for a moment, taking in the view. The place had once been my prison, my heartbreak, my battlefield. Now, it was my legacy. I smiled softly and whispered to myself, "He fired me publicly. I bought his business privately. And in the end, he thanked me because my revenge wasn't cruel, it was complete." And with that, I drove off into the sunset, my heart light, my spirit free. My story had begun with humiliation, but it ended with grace. Because true revenge, I learned, doesn't destroy sometimes, it rebuilds. And this time, I walked away with my head held high. I walked away from that chapter not as the woman he humiliated, but as the woman who rebuilt herself from the ashes he left behind. In the end, I didn't need to destroy him, life did that on its own. All I had to do was rise higher, quietly, gracefully. He fired me publicly, I bought his business privately, and when he thanked me, he didn't realize my silence was the sweetest revenge of all. If my story touched something in you, if you've ever been underestimated or pushed aside just because of your age, then you already know how it feels to rise quietly. Don't forget to share this story. Someone out there might need the reminder that it's never too late to start over. And tell me in the comments if you had the chance to face the person who once humiliated you. Would you forgive them, or make them finally see your worth?